Lieutenant Jeho Park rubbed his tired eyes as he stared at the computer screen. The clock on the wall showed 3:15 a.m., but he couldn't believe. Not yet. The strange signal patterns on his monitor had kept him at the Korean Space Research Institute long after his colleagues had gone home. "This can't be right," he muttered, reaching for his fourth cup of coffee. The signal was unlike anything he had seen in his 15 years of studying space transmissions. It wasn't random like most cosmic noise, but it wasn't like any human-made signal either. Jeho saved another copy of the data and walked to the break room to clear his head. The empty halls of the research center echoed with his footsteps. As he waited for the coffee machine to finish, his phone buzzed. It was Dr. Ha-won Kim, his friend, and the center's expert on historical texts. "Ha-won, why are you still awake?" Jeho asked. "I could ask you the same thing," Ha-won replied. "I saw you marked some files as urgent. What did you find?" Jeho walked back to his desk, coffee in hand. "Remember those old stories you showed me? The ones about demons sending messages to Earth?" "Of course." The ancient texts described patterns in the sky that priests would interpret as messages from other worlds. Ha-won said. "Why?" Jeho took a deep breath. "I think I found something similar. The signal I'm looking at, it matches some of the patterns in those old books." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Ha-won spoke, his voice serious. "Send me the data. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Ha-won arrived, his usual neat appearance was replaced by wrinkled clothes and messy hair. He pulled up a chair next to Jeho and opened his laptop. On the screen were scanned pages from ancient religious texts. "Look at this," Jeho said, pointing to his monitor. "The signal creates this pattern every 12 minutes. He showed a series of waves that formed a distinct shape. Ha-won's eyes widened. He quickly typed on his laptop and pulled up an old drawing. The pattern was almost identical to the one on Jeho's screen. "This is from a book written over 1,000 years ago," Ha-won whispered. "The priests called it the voice of the other world." Jeho felt a chill run down his spine. "But that's impossible. These signals are coming from deep space, millions of light years away." "Where exactly?" Ha-won asked, leaning closer to the screen. Jeho pulled up a star map. "Here," he pointed to a spot far beyond the edge of the Milky Way. "And the strange thing is, the signal is getting stronger." They worked through the night, comparing the signal patterns with Ha-won's historical records. As the sun rose over Daejeon, they had filled a whiteboard with notes and drawings. "We need to tell Director Choi," Ha-won said, looking at their work. Jeho nodded. "But how do we explain that we found a signal from space that matches 1,000-year-old demon stories?" "We show him the data," Ha-won replied. "The patterns are too similar to be a coincidence." As they gathered their findings, neither man noticed that the signal's strength had increased again. On Jeho's forgotten coffee cup, the liquid surface rippled slightly, disturbed by a vibration that no one could yet feel. Something was coming. 3 months after Jeho and Ha-won's discovery, the skies over South Korea changed color. It started as a faint red glow that most people thought was an unusual sunset. But Young-mi Lee, who worked at the research center with Jeho, knew better. "The signal is stronger than ever," she told Director Sang-hoon Choi during their emergency meeting. "Whatever is causing it, it's getting closer." The military had already surrounded the research center. Soldiers watched the sky with worried faces as the red glow grew brighter. News reporters gathered outside the gates, their cameras pointed upward. Inside the control room, Jeho watched his screens carefully. "It's not like any spacecraft we know," he said, pointing to the radar display. "It's moving too smoothly, too perfectly." The object in the sky slowed down as it approached. It didn't crash or explode like meteors do. Instead, it floated down like a leaf falling from a tree. The red glow became so bright that people had to wear special glasses to look at it. "It's choosing its landing spot," Ha-One said, watching through the window. It's not random. It knows exactly where it's going. The object, now clearly a ship of some kind, stopped directly above the research center's main field. It hung in the air, about 100 meters up. Everyone in the control room held their breath. Young Mi stepped closer to the window. She had studied alien contact protocols for years, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The ship was beautiful in a strange way, like dark red metal that seemed to flow like water. Then the bottom of the ship opened. A beam of soft red light touched the ground. Through the light came 5 tall figures. They walked down as if on invisible stairs. They looked just like the pictures in the old books. Ha-One whispered, holding up his tablet with ancient drawings. The beings were tall, with skin the color of deep red wine. They had elegant features that reminded people of classical statues, but something about them seemed not quite human. Director Choi's phone rang. After a short call, he turned to Young Mi. The president wants us to make contact. You're our best communicator, Young Mi. Are you ready? Young Mi nodded slowly. She had trained for first contact scenarios, but she never thought it would actually happen. I'm ready, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. As Young Mi walked outside with Director Choi and a small team, the beings waited patiently. They stood perfectly still, their presence both beautiful and frightening. The soldiers lowered their weapons when they realized the visitors weren't making any threatening moves. The tallest of the beings stepped forward as Young Mi approached. It smiled, a surprisingly human expression, and spoke in perfect Korean. We have waited a long time for this meeting, it said. My chosen name is Do-Hyun. We have much to discuss. Young Mi felt a mix of fear and wonder. As she looked into Do-Hyun's eyes, she saw intelligence and knowledge that seemed ancient, but she also saw something else, something that made her slightly uncomfortable. It was like looking at a mask and knowing there was something else behind it. The real story was just beginning. The meeting room at the research center was quiet except for the soft hum of air conditioning. Do-Hyun sat at one end of the long table, while Director Choi, Young Mi, Jae-Ho, and Ha-One sat at the other end. 2 more of the red-skinned visitors stood quietly by the door. Your world has known us for a very long time, Do-Hyun said, touching a small device on his wrist. A 3-dimensional image appeared above the table, showing ancient cave paintings of demon-like figures. Young Mi leaned forward. You're saying these drawings are of your people? Yes. Do-Hyun nodded. We have visited Earth many times throughout your history. Your ancestors did not understand what we were, so they called us demons. They created stories about us that became part of your religions. Ha-One opened his laptop and showed Do-Hyun the old texts he had studied. These patterns we found in your signal. They match writings from 1,000 years ago. Do-Hyun smiled. We left those messages on purpose. They were tests, ways to see if humans could understand complex patterns. We were waiting for your people to develop enough to recognize them. Jae-Ho thought about the signal he had found. Why wait until now to make full contact? Technology, Do-Hyun explained. Your society needed to reach a certain level before we could talk openly. If we had landed even 50 years ago, the shock might have damaged your social structure. Director Choi, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. And what do you want from us? The room grew very still. Do-Hyun's smile faded slightly. We want to share knowledge. Our civilization is very old. We have learned many things that could help humanity. Young Mi noticed something in Do-Hyun's voice when he said this. It was like when someone tells the truth but not all of it. She had studied communication long enough to know when people, or in this case, beings, were holding something back. What kind of knowledge? She asked carefully. Medicine, space travel, energy production. Do-Hyun listed these things smoothly, too smoothly. We have helped other worlds before. Ha-One looked up from his laptop. Other worlds. There are more civilizations out there. Many, Do-Hyun said. Some are very different from both humans and us. Would you like to learn about them? The humans in the room looked at each other. The offer was exciting, but young Mei could see that her colleagues shared her feeling that something wasn't quite right. Director Choi cleared his throat. "We would need to discuss this with our government first." "Of course," Du Hyun said. "We understand. We have time." He looked at each person in the room slowly. "All the time we need." As they left the meeting room, Young Mi touched Jai-ho's arm. "Did you notice how they avoided talking about themselves? Everything they said was about us, about Earth, about other worlds, but nothing about their own planet or why they really came here." Jai-ho nodded. "I noticed. Maybe it's time we did some research of our own." Behind them, Du Hyun watched them leave, his expression unreadable. The truth was still hiding, waiting to be found. Director Sang-hoon Choi stood in the newly created exchange center, watching as his team set up displays about human history. The government had approved a cultural exchange program with the visitors, and the research center had been expanded to include this new facility. Du Hyun and 3 other visitors walked through the displays, studying everything with great interest. They stopped at each screen, reading about human achievements in science, art, and technology. "Your species has made remarkable progress," Du Hyun said to Director Choi, "especially in understanding genetics and DNA." Young Mei, who was nearby arranging translation devices, noticed how Du Hyun's eyes lingered on the medical science section. She had been watching the visitors carefully over the past weeks, noting what caught their attention. In return for learning about human history, the visitors shared recordings of their previous visits to Earth. Ha-won spent hours studying these records in his office, comparing them with ancient texts. "Look at this," he said to Jai-ho one evening, pointing to his computer screen. "They say they visited this temple in Korea in 1242. But according to our records, that temple was completely closed that year due to a disease outbreak. No one could enter or leave." Jai-ho frowned. "Could their dates be wrong?" "Maybe," Ha-won said. "But I found 5 more places like this, places they claimed to have visited when historical records show it would have been impossible." Meanwhile, Young Mi made another interesting discovery. She noticed that Du Hyun spent a lot of time in the medical research wing of the facility. At first, she thought nothing of it. They had said they wanted to share medical knowledge. But then she saw something strange. One evening, when most people had gone home, Young Mi forgot her phone in the lab. When she went back to get it, she saw Du Hyun standing alone in the genetics lab. He was holding a strange device over some human DNA samples. Young Mi quickly stepped back before he could see her. The next day, she checked the lab records. None of the visitors had permission to be in that lab alone. When she mentioned this to Director Choi, he looked worried. "I'll speak with them about following our security rules," he said. But Young Mi could tell he was thinking about something else. Later that day, Director Choi called a private meeting with Young Mi, Jai-ho, and Ha-won in his office. He closed the door and turned on a sound-blocking device that the military had provided. "I received a message from the American research team," he said quietly. "They've been hosting some of the visitors too. Their scientists noticed something odd about our guests' medical tests." "What kind of odd?" Jai-ho asked. Director Choi placed a folder on his desk. "According to these results, their genetic structure is breaking down. They're dying, all of them, and they're looking for something that might help them survive." Young Mi thought about Du Hyun in the genetics lab. "They're not just here to share knowledge, are they?" "No," Director Choi said. "They need something from us, and I think it's more than just our friendship." Outside the office, the visitors continued their tour of the facility, their true purpose still hidden behind friendly smiles. The ancient library in Seoul was quiet as Ha-won, and Ji-ho searched through old manuscripts. After discovering the inconsistencies in the visitors' historical accounts, they had decided to look deeper into Korea's oldest records about demons. "Here's something interesting," Ha-won said, carefully turning the pages of a 1,000-year-old book. "This text warns about demons who come seeking the essence of life. It says they wear beautiful faces but hide dark intentions. Jaiho looked up from his own research. Does it say anything specific about what they wanted? Yes, Ha-Won replied, running his finger along the faded text. It says they were interested in blood and healing. The author writes that they took samples from healthy people, claiming they wanted to cure diseases. Back at the research facility, young Mei was making her own discoveries. She had been watching the visitors' research activities carefully since finding Du-hyun in the genetics lab. Today, she noticed they spent 5 hours studying human immune system responses. The pattern is clear, she told Director Choi in his office. Every test they run, every question they ask, it's all about human genetics and healing. They're especially interested in how we fight off diseases. Director Choi nodded slowly. The American team sent more data this morning. Their scientists found something in the visitors' genetic structure that's very strange. Their DNA doesn't repair itself the way ours does. When it breaks down, it stays broken. Young Mai thought about this. So when they said they wanted to share medical knowledge, they really meant they wanted to study our medical capabilities. Director Choi finished. Specifically, how our bodies heal themselves. That evening, as most staff were leaving, young Mei stayed behind to organize some files. She heard voices coming from the main lab and quietly walked closer to listen. The human's genetic structure is remarkable, she heard Du-hyun say to another visitor. Their ability to adapt and heal could be the solution we've searched for across thousands of worlds. But will they agree to help us? The other visitor asked. Once they understand what we need. They don't need to understand everything right now, Du-hyun replied. We have already collected many samples, if they refuse to help willingly. Young Mi backed away carefully and hurried to find Director Choi. When she couldn't reach him by phone, she called Jiho instead. They're planning something, she told him urgently. Something about taking genetic samples without permission. Where are you? Still at the library with Ha-Won, Jiho answered. And young Mei, you need to see what we found. These old books, they're not just stories. They're warnings about exactly what's happening now. As they spoke, in the research facility's secure storage area, several small devices hidden by the visitors quietly collected data from stored blood samples. The true purpose of their visit was finally becoming clear. Director Choi sat in his office, reading the report for the 5th time. The papers spread across his desk told a disturbing story. Young Mi, Jiho, and Ha-Won stood before him, waiting for his response. Are we completely sure about this? He asked, looking up at his team. Young Mi stepped forward. Yes, sir. The security cameras caught everything. Last night, the visitors activated hidden devices throughout the medical storage area. They'd been collecting genetic samples without permission for weeks. The ancient texts warned us, Ha-Won added. They described exactly this situation. Visitors who appeared friendly but secretly gathered human biological materials. Jiho opened his laptop and showed Director Choi a series of charts. We analyzed their research patterns. Every experiment, every question, every test, it all points to one thing. They're studying how humans heal and adapt to diseases. Director Choi stood up and walked to the window. Outside, he could see Du-hyun talking with other visitors near their ship. Their civilization is dying, he said quietly. Their genetic structure is failing, and they think human DNA might save them. But why didn't they just ask for help? Young Mai wondered. Fear, Jiho suggested. Fear that we would say no. Or maybe they've been rejected by other civilizations before. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was Du-hyun. The room fell silent as he entered. I believe it's time we had an honest conversation, Du-hyun said, looking at each person in turn. You've discovered our true purpose, haven't you? Director Choi nodded slowly. How long does your species have? Less than 50 years, Du-hyun replied. Our bodies are losing the ability to repair themselves. Each generation is weaker than the last. We've searched thousands of worlds, but human DNA is unique. Your ability to heal and adapt is extraordinary. So all this talk about cultural exchange was just a cover? Young Mai asked. No, Du Hyun said firmly. We genuinely want to share knowledge with humans. But yes, we also hope to find a cure for our people. The hidden sampling devices. He paused, looking ashamed. That was wrong. We should have asked directly. Director Choi walked back to his desk and picked up the report. These samples you took, what have you learned from them? That human DNA might be compatible with ours, Du Hyun explained. With proper research, we might be able to save our species. But we need willing participants, proper studies. We need your help. The humans looked at each other. The situation had changed from a potential threat to something more complex. Now they faced a difficult choice: help a dying civilization that had deceived them, or turn away and let them face extinction. We'll need to discuss this with government officials, Director Choi said finally. But first, we need complete honesty from you. No more secrets. Do Hyun bowed his head in agreement. No more secrets. You have my word. The next morning, government officials arrived at the research center. They'd brought scientists and military officers with them. The mood was tense as everyone gathered in the main conference room. Young Mai noticed more security guards than usual around the building. Through the windows, she could see military vehicles parked near the visitor's ship. The situation could turn dangerous very quickly if someone made a wrong move. We have confirmed unauthorized collection of genetic samples, Director Choi announced to the room. He stood at the front, with Du Hyun and 2 other visitors seated nearby. However, we have also learned important information about why this happened. A government official raised her hand. We found similar sampling devices in research centers across the world. How many samples did you take without permission? Do Hyun stood up slowly. 3,412 samples worldwide. We needed to test compatibility across different human genetic groups. He paused, looking at the angry faces around him. We understand now that this was wrong. Wrong is an understatement, Jae-ho said from his seat. You violated international law and basic human rights. The room grew louder as people began arguing. Some wanted to force the visitors to leave Earth immediately. Others worried about what would happen if the aliens became desperate to save their species. Young Mai watched Du Hyun carefully. The visitor's usual calm appearance was breaking. She could see real fear in his eyes. Please, Du Hyun said, his voice cutting through the noise. We face extinction. Our children are being born weaker each generation. Soon, our entire civilization will die. We acted wrongly because we are afraid. Director Choi raised his hands for silence. We have a difficult decision to make. The visitors broke our trust, but they're asking for help to survive. What they did was wrong, but letting an entire civilization die when we might be able to help them, that's also a heavy responsibility. Had-won opened his laptop and displayed an ancient text on the main screen. Our ancestors wrote about this exact situation. They said the demons would return in great need, and humans would have to choose between fear and compassion. A military officer spoke up. What if we help them, and they betray us again? They could use our genetic material to make weapons against us. That's impossible, Du Hyun said quickly. We need your genes to heal ourselves, not to harm others. We can prove this. Let your scientists examine our research completely. Young Mai stepped forward. I have a suggestion, she said. Why don't we create a controlled research program? Everything open, everything monitored. No secret sampling, no hidden agenda. Real cooperation between our species. The room grew quiet as people considered this idea. It wasn't perfect, but it might be the best way forward. Director Choi looked at the government officials. We need to make a decision. The future of 2 species might depend on what we choose today. 6 months after the crisis meeting, the research center had changed completely. New buildings stood next to the old ones, filled with scientists from both Earth and the visitors' world. Director Choi walked through the halls, pleased with what he saw. In the main laboratory, Young Mai worked with Du Hyun, studying genetic samples that humans had willingly provided. The relationship between the two species had improved since everyone agreed to work together openly. The results are encouraging, Du Hyun said, looking up from a microscope. The combination of human and our DNA shows strong healing properties. The first tests on our failing genetic structure are positive. Young Mai nodded, making notes on her tablet. And the human volunteers are all healthy. No side effects from any of the procedures. She had made sure to monitor every step of the research carefully. In another room, Jai-ho and Ha-won met with scientists from around the world. They shared information about the visitor civilization, learning about their history and technology. The ancient texts that once served as warnings now helped both species understand each other better. Our ancestors were right about the demons returning, Ha-won told the group. But they couldn't have known that the story would end with friendship instead of fear. Director Choi entered his office, where he found several messages waiting. The American research team reported success with their genetic trials. The European Science Council wanted to expand their cooperation program. Even countries that had been suspicious at first now wanted to join the project. He looked out his window at the visitor ship, which now served as both a laboratory and a symbol of cooperation. Several smaller ships had joined it, bringing more scientists and researchers from their world. But this time, everything they did was open and honest. The first children have been born, Du Hyun announced later that day during a meeting. 3 babies, all showing normal genetic structure. They are healthy and strong. His voice shook with emotion as he spoke. The room burst into applause. After months of hard work, they had found a way to save the visitor species. The combination of human genetic material and their advanced science had created a cure for their deteriorating DNA. What happens next? Young Mai asked Du Hyun after the meeting. We keep working together, he replied. There is so much more we can learn from each other. Your people have taught us that honesty and trust are more powerful than secrecy and fear. As the sun set over the research center, Director Choi met with his core team, Young Mai, Jai-ho, and Ha-won. They sat in his office, drinking coffee and looking at pictures of the healthy visitor babies. Sometimes the best endings come from difficult beginnings. Director Choi said, "Who would have thought that an ancient warning about demons would lead to saving an entire civilization?" Young Mai smiled. And we learned something too. Even when things seem frightening or uncertain, choosing to help others is usually the right path. Outside, the evening sky glowed with a gentle red light from the visitor ships. But this time, no one felt afraid. What had started as a mysterious signal and a potential threat had become one of humanity's greatest achievements, proving that compassion and cooperation could bridge even the gaps between worlds.